Hello and welcome to the Vine Life Podcast. I'm Tony Clark, your host. I've got a special guest, and his name is Larry Sanger. Now, Larry was instrumental as a co-founder of Wikipedia, the epic online encyclopedia, in 2001. And after a winding journey of deeply examining the best that atheism and skepticism had to offer, Larry was eventually converted to Christianity and is now writing an in-depth defense of the Christian faith. And we'll certainly discuss that and many other things in this interview. More information about Larry can be found at larrysanger.org. Once again, larrysanger.org. Larry, I can't tell you enough how exciting it is to have you on the program today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And just talking about your website, your blog, just a little bit, you've got a tremendous amount of information. You've got a lot of projects. You've certainly got a blog from everything, certainly how a skeptical philosopher becomes a Christian, which we'll certainly discuss, why encyclopedias are important to teaching my toddler to read. But one of the most fascinating things that I found on there is your love for the Irish fiddle.
Right.
I clicked on that link, and you've got many videos of you expertly playing the Irish fiddle. Just to start off the broadcast, start off the interview,
Sure.
Tell me about your love for the Irish fiddle. How did that come about?
My dad is an old folkie, so when people started playing a lot of folk music in the 1970s, he sort of got into it. And so he took me along to see the Scottish band Ossian and the Tannahill Weavers, and he was listening to some Irish music too. Eventually I sort of stopped playing piano as I did when I was a kid, got into fiddle, just because I wanted to play some instruments that was more portable and I didn't have to walk to campus to play there. It was, when I was a grad student, actually. So I got a cheap fiddle and started sawing away and basically taught myself. And I chose a particular style to focus on, that of County Donegal in Northwest Ireland. And basically it's been a hobby. I haven't been able to spend so much time on it in recent years, but I taught it for a little while, even for a living, before Wikipedia, actually. So yeah, it's just interesting that you're using really both sides of your brain there. We sometimes we think of intellectuals like yourself as just using one side of your brain, but you're kind of encompassing both, it seems like, with your love for music and you're also your love for those deep questions that you have. Yeah, for better or worse, I resist specialization. So, yeah.
Well, you're certainly it's certainly entertaining to watch those videos of you playing that instrument. Now, Larry, we talked about one of your articles, or one of your most recent articles, is how a skeptical philosopher becomes a Christian. And watching some of your interviews and reading some of your articles, you're certainly exploring those unanswered questions that you had about God, and you're still exploring those questions. And when I was listening to your interviews and reading those articles, a famous quote came up to me, and I want to ask you how it relates, or if it relates at all. But the famous mathematician Blaise Pascal, he's got a quote, and it's basically, I will butcher this quote here, but he says, "In faith there is enough light for those who want to believe, and enough shadows to blind those who don't."
Right.
Can you relate to that at all in your search for God?
Yes, absolutely. Basically, that sort of encapsulates the idea of what theologians call the Deus absconditus, so the hidden God. God hides from those who do not seek him, and he reveals himself to those who do. At least to some extent, a lot more. Yes, it will be difficult for you to understand the belief in God if you are very far from God. It will be very difficult to understand the Christian religion if you can't take the Bible seriously, for example. So yes, I've heard that before. It's a very good aphorism. So.
Well, and I was just, that quote just kept popping up when I was, because you certainly got an extreme hunger to understand what God is all about, what Christianity is all about. And you've talked about your journey to faith, basically. And you've also talked about in the past, you classified yourself, I guess, as an agnostic and not an atheist. And for those listeners that aren't exactly sure what those terms mean, can you kind of break that down for us? What's the difference between an agnosticism and atheism? Just in your own words.
Well, I'll give you the standard explanation, and then I'll explain why people are confused about it. So the standard philosopher's explanation is an atheist is someone who believes that God does not exist. Somebody who positively denies the existence of God. An agnostic is someone who neither affirms that God exists nor denies that God exists, refuses to take a position. Okay, now, agnosticism originally meant simply the claim that it is impossible to know whether or not God exists, which is slightly different. Slightly different. That's about what we can know, as opposed to whether you personally take a position or not. So what a lot of the people who call themselves atheists out there today will say is that they are atheist to agnostics, which in the mouth of a philosopher is kind of a contradiction. But what they mean is that they simply don't believe in God. But if you say, I don't believe in God, that doesn't mean necessarily that you believe that God doesn't exist. There's room in between. And I occupied that room in between, if that makes sense, I hope.
Absolutely. And I think in one of your interviews, you said that the reasons I had for disbelief had basically fallen away. So what were some of those reasons that you had for disbelief, and how did they fall away, just in general?
Well, it was actually kind of a long process. My family stopped going to church when I was about 13 or 14. And, throughout my teenage years, I just sort of lost the habit of praying. I seem to remember the belief kind of slipping away, like not caring about God anymore, to the point where I took a philosophy class in high school. So it was a big high school, so one of the things that they were able to teach was philosophy. In my junior year of high school, and the following summer, I basically formulated a principle that I shouldn't believe anything unless I knew precisely what I believed and why I was believing it. And I didn't really know what God was, and I didn't think I had adequate reasons to believe that God exists. That's sort of the conclusion that I came to. So basically, I started a process of what is called Cartesian doubt. I didn't know that that's what it was called at the time, but that's what it was. Basically, just getting rid of all of my beliefs, starting out from ground zero, from the most basic sorts of foundations, and trying to reconstruct your beliefs. But one of the beliefs that I got rid of, which Descartes didn't, by the way, is his belief in God. My belief in God. So, yeah.
Well, again, fascinating story. In your journey to faith, you talked about how you had many questions about God, and you started exploring those questions to find legitimate answers. And you also talk about how you still have questions about God. And my question to you is, does a person have to understand totally about God before they come to be a believer in God? Is that a requirement to understand God totally to believe that he is real?
No. Well, there's a lot of things that fall in the category of divine mysteries, and whereas I would have scoffed at the idea of a divine mystery for most of my life, I now actually find nothing really wrong with it. So I can explain this. For example, we cannot know what it is like to be a timeless being, or a being outside of time. But if God created space-time, right, then God created the order by which the universe is, organized, including space and time. Therefore, he's outside at least of our space-time. So what is he like in himself? Well, we have no basis for no way of knowing. Let's put it that way. But that's actually quite all right. We know enough other things about God to serve as a peg on which to put the rest of the things we want to say about God, so to speak. And before I just said, if I don't know what it means, for example, to create something from nothing with a thought, which I have no concept of that, but that's what we mean when we say God created the universe. Well, I don't know what that means. Nobody knows what that means exactly. We have a rough idea, I suppose. There are certain things we can say about it, but we don't know what it would be like. But I don't think I need to know what it is like to have evidence that that's true. So, yep, it gets technical very quickly, that particular line of questioning.
Yeah, and I've been privileged to have a conversation a couple of times with Dr. Hugh Ross, and you're probably familiar with him. He's an astronomer. He's also a Bible believing Christian as well, and he said that when he was a young child, he studied all of the major religions, and he also studied science and astronomy, and he basically said that all of the other world religions had no explanation for the creation of the universe. They were all over the place. But he said that his exploration of the Bible, and specifically the book of Genesis, correlated, I guess, to the Big Bang cosmology theory, that it lined up perfectly with that in his opinion. And because the creation model in the book of Genesis lined up with what he had studied in science, that led him to become more interested in the Bible. And because of that, he became a follower of Christ. But he looked at the evidence, and the evidence convinced him that from what he could understand, that the Bible is true. Do you kind of relate to that in your journey?
Well, yes, sort of. When I first started reading Genesis for really good understanding, I was surprised that I was able to come up with an account of what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2 that was faithful to the text on the one hand, but also consistent with science to a great extent, at least, if not completely consistent with science. And I didn't actually understand that before. So, but I wouldn't say that in my case it was like a reason for belief. It was more a reason not to disbelieve. Yeah, it sort of removed one of the grounds for doubt, I suppose you could say, that I would have had. Yeah, I think that answers the question.
Absolutely, and I'm curious with your you're very recent in coming out about your profession of faith and believing in God's existence and your faith as a Christian openly and publicly. I'm just curious with your relationships, maybe with colleagues in the past, maybe with relationships in the past. Were they surprised that you came out as an outspoken believer in God, a follower of Christ? Did you have any surprises? Did you have any maybe broken relationships or strained relationships because of your outspokenness now?
Not a one that I can think of, but that's also because I have lost touch with a lot of my former colleagues. I'm not an academic anymore. Last time I taught was 2005, so 20 years ago. I've continued to be interested in philosophy and write about philosophy sort of casually in my blog. I would say that, let's see, my close family were surprised because, my wife is she kind of believes in a God, or she did. I don't need to talk about her. My boys were kind of intrigued by the idea, let's just put it that way, because we had read some of the Bible before. But they were surprised. It's like, wow, you're changing your mind about this now. And my extended family, my siblings, my mom and dad, they both just overjoyed. And then, the people that I've worked with most recently seem to be perfectly happy, about it. No complaints there. So it is a little strange, maybe I'm a little isolated in my work. I've been working online for 20 years actually, mostly at home, So as I say, I've lost touch with a lot of non-believers. I think there was one guy who was a Christian. I remember when we were both grad students in the 90s, and he actually reached out. That was nice to hear from him. He's now a college professor, and some other of my fellow philosophers have written responses. In one way or another, I've talked to a couple, and they're very supportive. And I love hearing from philosophers. So.
Yeah, and it just kind of begs the question, and what I'm thinking here is Christianity often has the title of being unintellectual today. But are there any Christians out there who are maybe great philosophers, great scientists, great thinkers, great inventors that really propel you to explore more about God? I think you mentioned Lee Strobel, the Case for Christ, impacted you as well. Can you think of other folks maybe that are inspiring you to keep going?
I hadn't read either of those guys before I was starting to be converted. Let's put it that way. But I knew of some very distinguished, very smart philosophers who were also Christians. So the guy that I read the most of for my dissertation, his name is William Alston, and he's like a close colleague of Alvin Plantinga's. I'd read quite a bit of both of their work in epistemology, and the fact that they were both leading epistemologists, some of the best minds of their generation, and also Christians, that led me to conclude that it's not irrational, at least, to be a Christian. You know, if these guys are persuaded of something, I thought, then, well, I guess there's something there, but, you know, I just disagreed about the merits of the arguments, that's all, as I understood them. So.
Absolutely. And I'm curious as well. I'm kind of all over the place, and I apologize for that. But I think in your writings, you talked about you had some participation within the church as a child. And I'm just curious about, were there any seeds planted many years ago that are blossoming at this point? Maybe a Bible verse that you understood, that you heard as a child, now you understand what it means. Did any of that take fruition or come to blossom after many years of something maybe that you heard as a child in church?
That's a hard question, because it's hard for me to remember very many specifics, you know. I remember generalities, you know, going to Sunday school, going to vacation Bible school, you know, taking communion briefly after I'd been confirmed, and confirmation. But out of all of that, you know, I think I had memorized a few Bible verses, which I later forgot, but none of them really came back. The things that actually stuck with me more than that are my doubts, frankly, that I had as a child, which kind of were left unresolved. And that certainly is one of the main reasons why I stopped believing. It would have been hard to go through that process of Cartesian doubt that I was explaining about before and remain a Christian, especially today. So let's just say any sort of resistance to answering questions was only part of the explanation of why I never did, you know, why I lost my faith. So.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Larry, how has, in recent years, how has reading the Bible changed, in your opinion? I think that you mentioned that you're obsessive about studying the Bible and learning more just in recent years. How has that changed from, say, 10 years ago, or is there any change?
Yeah. Well, I mean, 10 years ago, I read bits and pieces to my sons a little bit. I assigned them to read parts of the Bible as part of their humanities curriculum, or we homeschooled them. But that's just because it's you know, the most influential book in the history of Western civilization, and I admitted that before I was converted. It was just obvious. But I didn't really study it at all until just before I was converted. In fact, it was the actual process of reading the Bible that was instrumental in my, you know, coming to faith once again. So, in fact, it didn't even take that long. I was praying to God and admitting that what I was doing is praying to God about less than 3 months after I started reading it. By the time I got into the Gospels, I basically said, yeah, I guess I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So, yep.
Just describe to us, what's your Bible study look like today?
Sure.
You've talked about being obsessive about it, studying it. So what's a day in the life of Larry look like in terms of Bible study and searching things out within the scriptures?
Well, these days I've got a Bible study group online going. Got a lot of new recruits. So many, in fact, it became so active that I had to close the doors for the sake of everyone's sanity. And I personally, I do the reading for the day twice, first in the NIV and then the KJV. The combination, I think, is very very useful, helps to understand the text in different complementary ways, I would say. And then if I have time, which I usually do or make time for, I read all the study notes from the ESV Study Bible, which is this mammoth tome. And I've right now the group is going through a 2-year study plan, and we will be finishing in the beginning of April. And I will have read all of the ESV Study Bible. Well, no, not all. About I think about 80% or so, something like that. And what else? Oh, well, we're also taking time out, which I think is a good idea. So as part of like the Bible reading, we interrupt the reading on some days to read introductions to books. So in fact, today's reading is an introduction to, or half of the introduction to James. So so that's just the Bible reading part of the study. I was actually doing more, not less, than that in my first 100 days. I actually read the Bible in 100 days, which is actually a lot. It required like 2 to 3 hours a day. It's like all of my evenings were taken up doing that. But I was kind of, obsessed. So.
And Larry, I'm curious as well. In this Bible study outreach that you have, and just your personal connections, have you been able to encourage others who may have been in similar situation, maybe in agnosticism in the past, and they're searching for God? Maybe have you had a chance to encourage some of those folks? Have you seen some growth, maybe in some areas of folks that you know that are searching?
I probably grew more than anybody. So they helped me. I have one young friend who was in the group for a short time, but then he quit. But the interesting thing is he had let's just call it a religious experience. And before that, he was an atheist, and now he's not. So at least he's taken a step in the right direction. But we talk a fair bit. Very bright, younger guy, designer. And there's a few others that I've found that I think I have helped to explain things to. People tell me afterwards, that things that I said helped. I know that a couple of people in the Bible reading group had never read the Bible all the way through before. So the group sort of inspired them to actually sit down and do it. And of course it's well known, I don't know if it's most, but a lot of Christians have not read. I think it is most Christians have not read the Bible all the way through. But especially if you believe in the God of the Bible, these are his words. They're not all direct quotations of God, but God inspired the whole thing. You can't really call yourself a Christian if you don't believe at least that much. And if that's true, then why wouldn't you read the whole thing? That's what I tell people. and not just that, but try to understand it. And these are the words of the creator of the universe. I mean, wouldn't it be the most fascinating thing you could possibly read?
Absolutely. And going back to one of the questions in the beginning of this interview, and I think I asked, why are Christians sometimes labeled as unintellectual? I think one of the answers to that, just in my own opinion, is many times we are. We're afraid to investigate the deeper things of God. We're afraid to have conversations with maybe an atheist or an agnostic because we're afraid we can't answer those questions. How would you encourage the Christian to, like you're doing currently, to dig into the scriptures and ask those tough questions?
I would actually caution them that if they don't do that, then they might very well fall prey to doubts later on that they can't deal with for various reasons. Maybe they're in a social situation, or they just don't have time, or they're just like traumatized by something. They just can't wrap their mind around the deep things of God, as the phrase has it. And I'll tell you this. I understand that because I grew up with it, right? That I'm not saying that my parents or my aunts and uncle and that those people that are like anti-intellectual. They're not at all, in fact. But yes, it is justifying, contending for, defending the faith, like it or not, if you want to do it really well, persuasively, in a way that actually answers people's hard questions, is it's not easy. Frankly, I think it resembles philosophy quite a bit, and philosophy is pretty hard for a lot of people. Now, when I actually sat down to finally read and understand the Bible, I'm not saying that I found it easy. It's not easy, but it comes naturally to me because I've exercised that muscle a lot. And I've taught beginning philosophers enough to know that when you're asking hard questions, challenging questions, some people do resist, and they get really nervous because they equate the asking of a question with that they can't immediately answer in some easy and obvious way with an admission that you don't know, and that shakes their faith. So I guess one thing that I would say to those people is that our faith is not in doctrine. Okay? I'll just say it again. Our faith is not in doctrine. Our faith is in God. And there's a huge difference. The faith that saves us is a faith in God. And if you look at the Bible scriptures about saving faith, you'll find that is consistently what is meant. All right? So this means that in a certain way, you can separate the questions you have about doctrine from your loyalty to God. And that's really important. So my loyalty to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is absolutely unwavering, has never changed, really, since I was converted. I'm not saying I'm never going to have a dark night of the soul, but one of the things that I thank God for is that through my many years of doubt, I basically got rid of all of my doubts, and now I'm actually in a point where I feel like I can actually understand doctrine pretty well. It's not that challenging for me to absorb all this theology that I've been reading. Not bragging here. I'm just saying that for a philosopher, it's not unfamiliar. It's very similar sort of field. But for the people who don't have that training, I just think that it's useful to get some of it. And I'll tell you this also, and this is absolutely true. When I was like reading the Bible for the first time all the way through for good understanding, I said, okay, I'm just going to like see what the Christians think about my skeptical doubts, about my questions. And at first, over and over, I was expecting, well, surely they haven't thought of this one. I'd look it up. Oh, I guess apparently there's a whole, classic history of writing about this question. And over and over again, I realized that the hardest questions that I asked have been addressed over and over again, and from different angles, and on most questions, consistent ways. Now, there are questions about which the theologians differ, but if you were to study theology, say, with a Catholic or with a arch independent fundamental Baptist, and you were just to study the Bible and just study basic doctrine and just get rid of your basic doubts, let's put it that way, the answers are going to be the same in most cases. The point is that the church, in the broadest sense, has a fairly consistent idea of how to defend the faith. There are certain areas, certain areas of doctrine that are about which there are different theories, but the differences don't actually matter that much. The point is that you can rationally defend the faith, and I myself, haven't made up my mind, but I'm sure that one of those things is correct, basically, about some of the options. So I guess that's how I explain it. Try to explain it to people. The most important thing that you need to do if you want to like prepare yourself for a serious skeptical doubts, whatever, is to study the Bible in depth, answering all the questions you can. Basically, I find ChatGPT, frankly, or now Grok 3, to be really useful. I mean, you just tell it what your biases are and say, answer within this scope. And sometimes it'll just sort of assume that based on the question that you ask, and it will actually give you a fairly useful, fairly accurate answer. And then, of course, you can look up sources if you don't believe it, what it's saying. And there are, of course, lots and lots of free resources online that can be used to answer your questions. Now, believe me, I didn't spend a lot of money on the resources to get my questions answered.
Well, and that was, Larry, that was another one of my questions is folks that find themselves in a similar situation that you have been in, you're still in, and you're searching for answers, those deep answers, those theological answers. What are some of the resources? You mentioned a couple, Chat and also Grok 3, I believe. But what are some of those other free resources that folks can get value out of that have helped you in the past?
So, got questions? I can't say .com or .org. I keep forgetting. I think it's .org. It's a good website. It's from a Reformed point of view. Nevertheless, most Protestants, at least, are going to agree with most of the answers. And I would say even most Catholics will agree with a lot of the answers, because a lot of them are just basic meat and potatoes stuff about what this means and what that means. And people explain those things in roughly the same ways across traditions. I also use, there's actually a lot of different compendia of of free commentaries online, but the one that I gravitate to the most, because I think it's got to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, that's really free, is a Bible Hub, BibleHub.com. You go to just look up a verse on that in that resource, and there's just a zillion links across the bottom of different resources that are connected to that. One of them says COM, that stands for commentaries. You click on that, and it just gives you, sometimes dozens of different commentary sections. And sometimes I'd think of a question, I'd first look it up in my go-to study Bible, which is another good thing to have. Like I have been using the ESV study Bible. I'm going to switch sometime soon because I've pretty much exhausted that resource for present purposes. But I'll go there first, but a lot of times I'll discover it's not there. The answer that I'm looking for is not there. So might search online, see if anyone has a good answer, and no, it's a very specialized question, so it's not there. But then I'll look deep into the commentaries, and a lot of times the sort of questions that I would have are actually addressed very well, like in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries by these brilliant theologians, which, for better or worse, mostly worse, a lot of scholars today ignore, and I don't. I love those old guys. So let's see. Another thing that is well worth getting, it's very important, is the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. So I realized as I was going through the first couple of times that there were like deep concepts that were at work, and one of the main reasons I wasn't understanding what I was reading is that I didn't understand a concept, and I needed a general introduction to it, like redemption. So constant talking about redeemer and redeem. So you can look up in that encyclopedia the article about redemption, and it explains it beautifully. And similarly, more obscure names that aren't explained anywhere else, place names, person names are will be explained in that resource. There are others, of course. I mentioned that only because it's exhaustive, it's orthodox, and it's $3, I think. So $2.
Larry, you're also writing, I think, basically a defense of the Christian faith, or you're in the process of doing that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how long it's going to be or how many parts it's going to be in. I'm on the third draft. I started basically in the spring or summer of 2020. Basically, I started writing it even before I was fully convinced that God exists. But the title is now God Exists, a philosophical case for the Christian God, and so first 250 pages or so are talking about the what's called natural theology. And what's unusual about this is about my approach to the topic is, although not that unusual, people do talk about this, but I really lay it out in detail. I apportion each conclusion to the argument, to the evidence of the argument that goes with it. So when I get to the end of the what's called the argument from consistency, I don't conclude and therefore God exists. I conclude and therefore a necessary being exists. Or when I get to the end of the argument from causality, I conclude and therefore a causal explanation outside of the universe exists. And then it takes some further argument, but it's not that hard to argue that the necessary being is also the cause, and so forth. So this is called a cumulative case, but I think it also can be considered what logicians call an argument from the best explanation. So you basically take all the premises or evidence of the arguments together. You consider it all, as it were, in a picture, and you ask, what's the best explanation of these things? The hypothesis of God makes perfect sense. The Christian God, once you add in an argument from Scripture, makes the best sense of it. But the notion of that there is no explanation, which is quite frankly the only other thing on the table. You can say it's polytheism, but that I won't get into it. But that really won't do. That's really the only other thing on the table, as far as I'm concerned. But that just leaves a lot of I don't know, mysteries, doubts, and it's ultimately anti-intellectual. Believe it or not, I think it is. So that's the last half. Maybe it'll end up being more like 2/3 is what I call the argument from Revelation. So the first part of that talks about how the traditional arguments for God, again, what we're calling natural theology, is reflected in a very fine-grained way in the Bible. In other words, the God of the Bible just is the God of natural theology, which was surprising to me when I read the Bible, and actually I was familiar with all of those traditional arguments, but I was not familiar with the Bible, and I was kind of surprised at just how many of the premises of the arguments for the existence of God are there in the Bible. And then I also in the middle right now of basically a defense of the Bible, essentially trying to show that it's that it's plausible. It fits certain rules and criteria that you would come up with before reading the Bible. So this is a classic sort of apologetic. But if there's one thing that I'm trying to do that I haven't seen done very much, it's doing the whole thing, like trying to bring it all together in one place, and in a really systematic way that shows the how the different parts of the different arguments fit together. So it's going to take me a while to finish. I've been working on it for 5 years, and it'll probably take me a few more. I've had some publisher interest, let's put it that way. So.
Well, and definitely, and you've got other things going on besides this, correct? In your life, you've got other projects that you're working on. You want to talk about those as well?
Well, I wish I could work full time on philosophy and theology, but I can't. I am the president of the Knowledge Standards Foundation, and what we spent several years doing is collecting over 60 encyclopedias, over 30 free to distribute encyclopedias, what are called open content encyclopedias, like Wikipedia, making them all available from a couple of different search engines and encyclopedia readers, and then there's another several dozen where they're free to read online, but they're not free to share. So we have links. And then there's like some ancillary things that we've done. We've got a database of all the encyclopedias online that we could find. So we don't even have 1/10 of the encyclopedias that there are available online. And there's even more free, like single volume encyclopedias. Like my ambition here is ultimately to digitize all of the old encyclopedias and make them available on websites. I actually want to do that with all the books. All the free books out there really need to be not just made available in PDF form, because that's done with most books, not all of them, but most. But what does not exist are the text of the books properly recognized, and what they call OCR. This is like where you take a picture of some text and then you automatically translate that into text that you can edit. It's gotten really good in the last several years, like since about 2021. It's been really hyper enhanced by AI. So now it's I actually think that we, in the next several years, are going to be to the point where we can have like 1.5 million books on a like 2 terabyte disk. Wow. So like basically everybody could have a copy of all of the free books in the world, which is really what ought to be the case. And like if the rich people of the world, and I'm not one of them, want to spend their money on something, there couldn't be a better cause than that, basically, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, again, fascinating work that you're involved with, especially coming from Wikipedia, certainly, to you're still in the encyclopedia business, so to speak, correct?
Pretty much.
Larry, folks that are listening on a podcast, they're listening to your story, your conversion, your search for truth, or they're watching the interview as well. What do you want folks to come away with? What do you want folks to learn about Larry Singer?
I wouldn't want them to learn anything in particular about me. I'm not that important. What a question.
Your search for faith, your journey, maybe you could help others that are in the same boat, basically, that are searching for truth. I see. Yeah.
Right. That's a hard question. Like
I know there are folks just like you that that are philosophers, that are considered intellectuals, and they're searching for God. How would you direct them?
What I've been telling people basically since I started reading the Bible myself is you just got to read the Bible all the way through. It takes about a year. And if you do it for like a half an hour a day, maybe an hour if you're looking up your answers. And basically, if you don't look up your answers, then you're not going to make it all the way through, probably, unless you're already Christian and you're already motivated to power through. But if you have any sort of significant doubts, basically, and you want to at least understand what Christianity is about, as I did, then I would just say, you just got to sit down and do the hard work sometime, eat your spinach, and you'll discover it really is quite delicious, and the most nutritious thing you could ever imagine eating. At least that's the conclusion that I came to. The Bible, a lot of atheists have taken to saying lately that, like, if you want to become an atheist, read the Bible. Mm-hmm. But that's only if you are the kind of sort of mocking, critical, or I would say faux critical thinker. A truly critical one who just reads the Bible in order to find the ridiculous stuff. You'll get bored doing that anyway. You won't make it through if that's all you're doing. But no, a truly critical thinker is somebody who does not make up his mind and just like leap to whatever the establishment tells him he ought to believe. It requires what I used to call intellectual individualism. It is very hard for an intellectual individualist to come to God, though. So I'm not recommending that to anybody, but it's possible. And there are a lot of people, for better or worse, who have been trained that way. You know, that's what they learned in high school and then in college. That, you know, it's some people call it relativism, but that's relativism is crazy in my view. It's self-contradictory. But what people are still left with is this notion that, you know, they are making up their own minds about everything, and they it's up to them. They don't have any authorities that they look up to or anything. And this is one of the main reasons why they just can't get into the Bible, because the people who are into the Bible, they know, take it as an authority. I take it as an authority, right? The thing is, though, it's possible to argue yourself, or maybe the Holy Spirit will help you argue it to yourself, so to speak, into taking the Bible as an authority. I actually think that the Bible is the Word of God, divinely inspired, and this means that when you read it, things are going on that you're not aware of, that are part of God's will for you. So this isn't I mean, again, some atheists will hear that and say, oh, well, I don't want to read it then. But I guess what I'm saying is it can't hurt. If God actually does exist and persuades you, then that would, I think, be a good thing. And if he doesn't exist and you're simply bringing your native intellectual talents to bear on the text, then great, go ahead, do that. But do find out what the Christians say about your questions. And don't go around thinking the way I did, that they have no answers, because they do. That's what theology is. You didn't know that? This is what I would have told myself. Well, that's what it is. It is the attempt to answer all the hard questions about the Bible. Now, it's more than that. It's an attempt to systematize the concepts that are behind the Bible and behind the concepts behind the concepts, so to speak. But it is definitely that. Anyone who has mastered theology and picks up the Bible and reads things that the skeptics say are like terrible problems that cannot possibly be solved about the Bible, this is child's play to them, right? It's child's play to me at this point, to be quite honest. The sorts of doubts that I had, I should add, not all of them. I'm not meaning to brag or anything here. I think this is true of anyone who has studied, any faithful Christian who has studied theology enough, right? You get to the point where certain sorts of objections, the answers, you can give the answers in your sleep. It's just obvious. It's part of of our understanding of the text, you know. And it's just a matter of figuring out what the best way to express what the answer is. You know, the problem of evil is a very good example. There hasn't been anything new said about the problem of evil that's worth mentioning, probably in hundreds of years. But it's there have been new formulations. There have been ways that will appeal more to people now. So I'm not saying that you should read only the old stuff. You can learn a lot from people making videos who just like read a book in seminary. I think I did. So anyway, I guess that'll have to do.
Absolutely. Larry, folks that are watching this podcast or listening, they're fascinated in your story. They're fascinated in the projects that you're currently involved in as well. How can they support you? What's the best way to follow you? Keep up to date with what your activities are. What's the best way to get in contact?
Well, you know, for my latest content personally, it would be larrysanger.org. If you want to learn about the Knowledge Standards Foundation's projects and support the nonprofit, you would go to encyclosphere.org. It's like it sounds, encyclo and then sphere.org. I hate to mention this because people will start buying them, and I've got too many orders at this point that more than I can keep up with. But we are selling a 128 gigabyte flash drive with all of the contents of, as of last June, of the Project Gutenberg. So almost 70,000 books. And you can export them in PDF or EPUB right from the disk. So they are offline copies of the books, which is, you know, future-proofing things. My hope is that, you know, in the after the Holocaust or whatever might happen in the future, a collapse of Western civilization during the 3.5 years, who knows what, people will be able to access these at least. But at any rate, you can also take notes, and it's got highlights and sort of a bespoke book reader that I made myself, actually. So with the help of AI, but yeah, it was very involved.
Well, I know folks that are listening, they want to support you. They want to learn more about you. And you can certainly do that by going to your website. And that's Larry Sanger, and I apologize, .org or .com? It's .org, correct?
.org.
LarrySanger.org. Larry, it's been a blessing for you to come on and just tell the audience about what you do and where you came from and where God is leading you and your search for God and understanding the deeper things of God. I will ask you to hang on 30 seconds post-interview, but Larry, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.